of the Organizing Committee of the ANCIPS 2020 to the plenary session that will be delivered by Dr. Helen Herman, who is the President of the World Psychiatric Association. And for that, may I request our chairpersons for this session, Dr. O.P. Singh, who is a consultant psychiatrist in Kolkata and also is the honorary editor of the Indian Psychiatric Society, and Dr. Gautam Shah, who is the organizing secretary of ANCIPS 2020, to come on stage and introduce Dr. Herman. Over to you, sir, Dr. O.P. Singh.
It is a really great honor and privilege for us to host the President of World Psychiatric Association, and she has spared her time and traveled all the way from Australia and also participating in all the activities. We are thankful to you, ma'am. And the other, she has been the past president of International Association of Women's Health, and she has held numerous positions and various research activities. She has been professor of psychiatry and director of research at Oxygen Youth Health Research Center and Center of Youth Mental Health. So I will request Madam to please.
Thank you very kindly to the chairpersons and to Professor Singh and colleagues. I'm delighted to be with you and thank the organisers for the invitation. So I was asked to talk about parenting and mental health in the digital era. And thinking about that, I thought maybe it's a question of is there peril or promise in thinking about digital technologies and mental health and parents? Well, first of all, being in Calcutta is a very special experience, a city with very many stories and very many sides, I know. And this is my first time, and look forward to learning more about your city. So I will make some remarks, first of all, about parents and mental health in this era of digital technology. Then follow that with talking a little about mental health in the digital era and how does this match with the WPA, for instance, the WPA agenda for community-oriented mental health practice. What can we do in psychiatry to be equipping ourselves to think about mental health in the digital era, let alone advise parents or think about how parents can receive greater support in the changing eras. So thinking about parents and mental health in the digital era, and why do I say peril or promise? So this is a story from a colleague. This is 1 year on from the annual meeting of the World Economic Forum in Davos last January. And this was the first year that mental health was featured extensively in the Davos meeting, and it's there again this year. And that's part of that is the World Economic Forum has what they call a Global Future Council on Mental Health and Technologies. And I've been serving as the co-chair of that, and this is a chance to reflect a little on some of that work as well. So in this particular panel, the panelists had a lot of relevant experience about mental health and digital technology. But the most memorable aspect of the session, my colleague commented, was the palpable wave of anxiety coming from the audience. This was a Davos audience, so people who were very accomplished in business, had achieved highly in the international organizations in the United Nations or in international non-government organisations or governments. Most of the audience had little idea what their children or young people were doing on social media, and there was little collective experience that would help them decide what guidelines to adopt. So then we start to think about what help is there for parents and what should be done to improve the guidance that's available. Do the parents Google, and what do we know is out there? The general conversation that we hear is the anxiety that the rapid uptake of new technologies has made the risk of poor mental health greater for children and young people. And they're concerned about child development. What happens when a child is exposed to a screen at a young age for a long period of each day? And it also increases, people are worried about the increased risk of self-harm and suicide among young people. And is this being prompted, is this being promoted by digital technologies, by use of social media sites? Now, I think obviously there is a real sense of concern about this. There may well be good reasons for this, but we also can recall the stories that people tell us that when the printing press was invented and people were thinking about how to spend time, there was a great deal of anxiety reported about what would be the future of humanity if people were spending all their time reading books. So we do need to think about this as managing change and managing expectations and concerns as well. And there's a contrast in that many of us who work in mental health, there's a contrast to those general views, if you like, that we're intrigued by the potential positive influences of new technologies and the social media as well, and how, if these are well managed, the benefits of these to mental health can far outweigh the negative influences. So how do we know what's true, though? One thing we can be sure about is that we're not going to be able to wish away or to conceive of the digital world disappearing. The digital environment is where young people go for connection, for information. They get help from peers, particularly those young people who are more isolated or have some disability or other disadvantage, and for self-help as well. So there are a lot of good things about the digital environment. But then we start to come to the negatives. And if we think about those young people who have a higher than average risk of mental health problems through having a disability, perhaps having chronic ill health of any kind, who are affected by family disruption from violence or divorce or some other mishap. People who are members of a minority group for any reason, through race or recent arrival or being same-sex attracted, or isolated, living in a rural or remote area or not speaking the language. Here the online world can be a positive link to people in a similar situation or predicament. But parents seeking advice often feel isolated, and they can feel neglected by services. I think many of us who work in the health service systems can recognise that the young people sometimes express impatience with their parents, and the clinicians can well feel that it's not easy to interact with parents, or may not have time to do so, or may not feel equipped to do so. Yet interventions that help parents in supporting the resilience of their child can be effective. This is one of the areas of practice, curiously enough, where there's very little evidence. The recent reviews have shown us that, talking of the real world, the face-to-face world, that nobody really quite understands the evidence that there is to support working with parents when children have depression or a behavioural disorder or some developmental problem. But online, parents can find information about family life and links with peer groups. This might make them feel less responsible for the ill effects on a child or shame, and they may get practical advice this way. And websites, there are quite a few websites, of course, that provide help for young people. They can also be useful for parents, as long as parents and young people can identify those. And there's direct advice for parents online as well, although not as much as we might expect, and where to find it again. So there's been one very recent report that pulls this together. In fact, it was only this week that it came, the past week it was released, from the Royal College of Psychiatrists on technology use in the mental health of children and young people. And this is a useful resource in that it gives a number of other sources of information as well. So I thought I'd mention briefly some of the points that they make before going on to talk about digital mental health more broadly. Again, they emphasise that the digital world is not going away. Children are using technology at an increasing rate each year. That much of the research about the effects of this is unhelpful because, for instance, the researchers may talk about the influence of screen time on positive or negative characteristics. But screen time can range from a range of positive, a range of activities that are likely to produce benefits, as well as a range of activities, particularly in overuse, that can produce disbenefit. So focusing for a moment on the benefits, young people can read novels online, do research for a school project, play games with other people, even in other parts of the country or the world, and learn to enjoy cooperative activities. They can communicate instantly with others. They can be creative, get access to high-quality information, socialise, and get online support for a range of things they may be embarrassed to talk to others about, or even unable to talk to others about for a range of reasons. But what are the potential challenges? These are possibly well known, but just to put them together, especially notable in those young people with the vulnerabilities and the disadvantages mentioned earlier. That more time online means less time interacting with face-to-face with families and friends, less time for exercise and less time for sleep. And when we come to the recommendations for parents, this report is recommending that children get a good quota of sleep. This features very heavily. That they're exposed to distressing online content, to violent or sexual imagery, and to hate speech. Unless there are boundaries very carefully placed around the online usage, this is quite likely and quite possible. And all of this leads to adverse effects on weight, onto their mood and body image. The whole question of self-esteem is emphasised very heavily. And in fact, this report is preceded by a foreword from a parent who lost his 14-year-old daughter to suicide, an apparently very happy and successful and sociable young woman who had an online life filled with fear and disgust that her parents knew and friends knew nothing about. So how common is that? And the rising rates of self-harm in various countries, including the UK, including many of our own countries. I'm not sure of the situation in India, but there is almost an epidemic of self-harm among young people in a number of countries at the moment. And the question of technology addiction, especially prevalent in North Asia, where the concept of hikikomori is a concern for parents and young people in Japan, young people locking themselves away in their rooms and not emerging even for meals, and playing games and interacting with others online. And that this is a concern apparently as well in Korea and in China and other countries. So what are the recommendations this report puts out for parents? I said the core principles of parenting are relevant, being open to discussion, praising positive activities, being ready to listen to a child, and from a young age encouraging discussions within the family about what is being experienced online, so the young person can be open if they're receiving, they've seen something distressing online or they're being bullied. And to try to make changes by talking about the benefits, for instance, of good sleep routines, and be open about the parents about their own concerns and the reasons for trying to change the behaviour if they have them. And to know where to go for advice about if they're worried about a child, if the child's spending too long online or becoming more withdrawn. And it gives some hints about where to go for helpful advice. And setting screen time boundaries. For example, for a young child, there should be no screen time, according to this group of experts, in the first 2 years of life, and 1 hour a day maximum for quite young children. And maybe more, but still some boundaries for older children and young people. Promote that balance of activities we were talking about, being able to still give time to other relationships and to sports and exercise, and plenty of time for sleep, as mentioned. And advice on making sure that they can be aware if there's distressing exposure or bullying, or if not, to seek advice on that as well. And talking to their child or young person about what's it like to get those hurtful comments, and the question of comparing themselves to others, worrying about their self-image, and this fear of missing out. These are seen as new concerns that parents of earlier generations didn't have to contend with in such an obvious or frequent way. So thinking about mental health in the digital era, in this broader sense, we've been talking about parenting and about concerns about child development and the development of young people, as well as what about when there are concerns about mental ill health or the failure to thrive or failure to achieve the potential the parents can see. What tools are we developing? In which way are we interacting as a profession with the digital era? So this, I'm going to tell a story in these two slides. So it's written here in case you want to follow it that way. This is from a report called Empowering 8 Billion Minds that comes from that World Economic Forum Global Future Council on technology, mental health and technology. So this is a story of imagination. Imagine the following, that AJ lives in India, and I'm not making this up, this is in the report, so very appropriate. In his teens, he experienced an episode of depression. So when, as a new undergraduate, he was offered the chance to sign up for a mental health care service, he was keen to do so. AJ chose a service using mobile phone and internet technologies to enable him to manage carefully his personal information. AJ would later develop clinical depression, but he spotted that something wasn't right early on because his mental health care app highlighted changes in his sociability. He was sending fewer messages and leaving his room only to go to campus. So at that stage, his healthcare app that he'd signed up to sent him a message inviting him to get in touch with a mental health therapist, offering a choice of channels through which he could get in touch. So remember, this is a imaginary story about the future, 10, 20 years' time, if we follow the line of digital psychiatry. So to continue, AJ is now in his mid-20s. His depression is well under control. He's learned to recognise when he's too anxious and beginning to feel low. He practices the techniques he's used with the online tools and makes use of easy access to high-quality advice online. So his progress through the rare depressive episodes that he still experiences is carefully tracked. If he doesn't respond to this self-care treatment at first, he can be quickly referred to a medical professionals. So in this world of the future, AJ's experience is replicated across the world in low, middle and high-income countries. And similar technology-supported mental illness prevention, prediction and treatment services are available to all. Now, is this a future that we can anticipate with confidence? Maybe so. And what do we need to do to get there? And is it what we want? In view of the lack of access to mental health care for most of the people in most of the world, there's something to be said for it. But how do we do it? So, mental health in the digital era has several aspects. We're familiar now with the possibilities for telepsychiatry, and that's because we've been working with it for 20, 30 years. It began when people were excited about the idea of setting up cameras and telephones together in one room and having someone a long way away listen to what and watch what was happening. But the interest and development was very much focused on the technology, which now we take for granted, and the systems. Who paid for that? Who arranged for the patient and their carer or their general practitioner to be there and for the psychiatrist to be in the other room? So this is still the case with digital psychiatry. We need the systems, the regulations, the ethical considerations. So we need that clinical and human support, as well as the new technologies. And I'll just refer to the latter for a moment now. What are the new technologies of all sorts that can help us at different phases of the clinical journey? So technology has the potential to support individuals across the mental health care continuum. I won't go into this in detail. This is just to rehearse for all of us, because I'm sure everyone's familiar with most of this. Self-care and wellness, apps, wearables, trackers, podcasts. They mentioned TED Talks as interesting thought there, and websites. Then assessing a decline in functioning or in experience, in diagnosis and advice through a whole range of possibilities, from phone helplines and websites to texting services. Putting a treatment plan in place. What sort of assistance may there be with that, with integrating digital-based technologies with the rest of healthcare and the health plan? And management and monitoring and self-care. What about follow-up? Can this enrich follow-up or replace follow-up or complement it in other ways? So the WPA Lancet Psychiatry Commission on the Future of Psychiatry, chaired by Dinesh Bugra, reported in 2017 on digital psychiatry. And it talked about, it defined it as the use of mobile and other connected digital services to offer mental health services beyond traditional telepsychiatry. So this also described the real possibility of this closed-loop system of people having access to technology relevant to mental health that collects data, whether it's from wearable devices or from smartphones or other devices, sharing them with the healthcare system and then providing feedback, either automatically or through clinician involvement, say with neuroradiology or similar. And with the use of big data sets and artificial intelligence, the possibilities for this are increasing as well. So there is this potential of a closed-loop system, but this will be determined and shaped by the real world and social forces that shape the field. So it is very much beyond the technology on its own. So the things that are imperative in the field are for care and the types of care we need to provide, and the experience of users and their needs will shape the field. And we as clinicians need to be engaged, that's critical. And even with advanced technology, the foundation of healthcare and especially psychiatry remains based on trust and a strong doctor-patient relationship. And there are significant ethical considerations around the use of technology in mental health care. Coming back to the World Economic Forum, it assessed the ethical considerations for digital psychiatry. So we're working with governments, policymakers and business leaders, as well as the data scientists and the practitioners. So this is the big and new type of coalition that needs to be working on this. Thinking about building trust. What are the protocols for using big data? And the only definition of big data that sticks in my mind is this is information that comes at us fast, in huge volume, and in without a break. It's a whole avalanche of information that comes at us with increasing speed, and how that's analysed and managed. So we need protocols for this. The sort of examples that come to mind are how to deal with, again, the products of brain imaging, of the products of a whole range of tests that may be done on people, as well as their data from history. That we need to be aware of the need to intervene still on stigma and quality of care, that these are problems that are not solved by technology. In fact, we may be able to harness technology to help, but unless we do, we're still unable to make good and ethical use of technology. But on the other hand, it can promote broad and equal access to treatment, that if people have not been able to get access to care, then in providing greater access, we need to pay continuing attention to equality and equity, and balance safety and efficacy with the need to address these treatment gaps quickly. So in other words, this technology is here, but do we rush out and offer it to everybody in India who doesn't have access to care, or do we have to create a balance? And one example relevant to parents that is something that's coming fairly quickly now, but the follow-up to care, for example, with first episode psychosis, there's been the development of online social networking with expert and peer moderation and evidence-based psychoeducation within a single application. This particular example is called Altitudes, and the primary aim of this trial is to evaluate the effectiveness in reducing stress in carers over a 6-month period. So this whole idea that the moderated online social therapy has been used for following up the young people themselves and extending the period of first episode care by intermixing these platforms with clinical care. And now this is being applied for parents as well to see the added value of that. So I just wonder how the time is going. Do I have another? Okay, I'll just talk briefly about how we need to equip ourselves and how through the Indian Society for Psychiatry and WPA, we can be thinking about this. So the WPA does have a strong network. We're an association of member societies in 120 countries affiliated with the World Health Organization. And we're more and more working in partnership with various groups. And this is the vision, and this is, although I think it sounds modern, this was created 70 years ago when WPA was founded. So it's a vision for a world in which people live in conditions that promote mental health and have access to treatment and care that meet professional and ethical standards, integrate public health principles and respect human rights. So the plan of action for this triennium builds on previous work to expand the contribution of psychiatry to improve mental health worldwide, and particularly reaching people who face adversity and disadvantage. This is where I wanted to think with you about how this can be applied to thinking about parenting under all sorts of conditions. We may think about parenting in our own lives, but what about for people living in refugee camps or urban slums, and what's it like for them when the young people have their smartphones, and what are they doing? So this work is based on collaborating successfully with other organisations and working with those psychiatrists who want to use their expertise in a range of community settings. And there are many of them, as we know. So some of the earlier work that leads into this is when we invited some years ago service users and family carers to join in the work, recognising their essential contribution and recognising their needs. And this is equivalent to the things we've been talking about with parents as well as young people with lived experience. And we made recommendations for the international mental health community about best practices in working with service users and carers. There are 10 of them. I'll just mention 2 or 3 of them. So human rights is the basis of successful partnerships for mental health, and that everything about the lives of people and care of people with mental disorders need to be developed in collaboration with them and their carers. These recommendations are now included in WPA's Declaration of Madrid. It's its ethical set of declarations that all the member societies have subscribed to. And 2 of the others are that the best clinical care is done in collaboration, as well as education, research and quality improvement in mental health care. So what we're doing now is working with member societies and others, particularly the Royal Australian New Zealand College of Psychiatrists at the moment, to support the contribution of psychiatrists and other mental health professionals to minimise coercion in mental health care, to think about core competencies in mental health for family doctors, working with the World Association of Family Doctors. And there's a very strong reflection in that we as psychiatrists, from some joint survey work, that we can resonate with. And training and supporting other health workers to recognise depression, for example, midwives, to train and work with them, but also continue to provide access and support. Working in schools and similar principles, training and supporting teachers to manage disruptive behaviour and encourage life skills. And working with other community workers, with young women and men with mental health needs in community settings. So how does this relate to working with parents in particular? So this is leading into the challenge of community-oriented practice, that if we think of our role in a broader sense is to strengthen the capacity of communities to respond to mental health needs. And if we're doing this by building relationships that respect families, communities, that have their own history and identities, including those situations where there are emergencies and people living in the urban slums and rural poverty, as mentioned before. And engaging parents in these settings, and in all of this guided by service users and family carers. So we need mental health practitioners with the readiness for community engagement and teamwork and systems thinking. And we need to be thinking about the knowledge, skills and attitudes that we have, whether it's in our role as professionals, that we are thinking about health promotion and prevention, as well as treatment of mental ill health and recovery and rehabilitation. Should we be thinking about expanding the psychiatry training to move beyond even community clinics, to move into communities working with non-government organisations? I know India, as I mentioned last night, is the place where we see more of this than most other parts of the world. So we come to India to learn about this. But we need to diversify let the research follow this experience, make sure we have research on these activities in community settings in all countries. And advocate for mental health across sectors, whether it's midwifery, whether it's perinatal health in community settings, whether it's schools, or whether it's community places where young people gather. And we need to engage as a culture, we need to engage in participatory approaches and to work with people with lived experience, particularly adversity. And we can think of ourselves in a sense by inverting the care pyramid, that we're essential to mental health work in the community as professionals, but we are training and supporting leaders in primary health care, the community workers, and in the community self-help sector. So I'll just conclude by saying that support for parents and development of digital psychiatry, we're thinking about promoting mental health as well as preventing and treating mental illness and supporting recovery, about partnering with people with lived experience, the parents and the children and young people themselves. They are at the core of this work, as well as with other health professionals and digital scientists and business leaders and the governments and policymakers. And to equip ourselves as psychiatrists to work as partners, with partners in communities. And one segment of that, one important segment, is working with parents and jointly grappling with the challenges of the digital era and picking up the opportunities and the story of AJ, let's hope that that's true in India and in Europe and Australia and everywhere in the world. And overall in this work to be guided by the parents and young people. And I'll finally mention, we look forward to seeing you in Bangkok in October for the 20th World Congress of Psychiatry, where we'll be celebrating, WPA, and all of us be celebrating 70 years of WPA. Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am. It was an excellent, elaborative and informative. So, ma'am, please take your seat. And over to Dr. Officer.
It is an excellent lecture, actually, the two parts covering the two burning issues of our time. First, the use of digital technology for the children and how parents will deal it. Because now schools are offering education only on tablets. They are not using copies, not using books. So how can we keep those kids away from technology and other things? So there are major issues on this. She has elaborated on this. And secondly, as a WPA work, and ultimately we have reached to the community. And we have to orient ourselves to provide services so that we can reach in the community rather than being the apex of the pyramid. So with this, I think there will be a lot of questions. So we open this for all the questions. Dr. Sharma, please.
Floor mic, please. By this time, I am telling it's really what Dr. O.P. Singh has mentioned. It is really problematic. In fact, in our home also, you can face this problem. In the way when you are discussing about internet addiction, we are telling that maximum timing you can provide to your kids is 1 hour screen time. Screen time is important. But if you ask your kid, he says that my notes are coming through WhatsApp. Lectures, what Dr. Singh mentioned, they have sent their notes through internet. Internet, they got the suggestions, they got the teaching materials. So this is the question. It is basically how you use it in the digital area, how much is effective, and I think ma'am can answer all these things. Dr. Sharma, please. Oh, it's a mic.
I'm Avdesh Sharma from Delhi. I wanted to share an experience, something which is ongoing in the same area, and probably that's something that could be replicated across the world. We did a survey last year, and we went across to 12 cities in India, and we tried to find out from parents and students, 2,000 of them, what is their experience of using digital technology and the social media. And the answers that came up was about half of the people said it's extremely useful, but also 3/4 approximately across the cities, north, south, tier 1, tier 2, said that it has made communication being lost between parents and children and even amongst peers. So we have launched an initiative with the help of Government of India across many schools, and we would be covering in 13 cities, training counselors, training teachers, and training parents, and training students. 25,000 parents would be covered, about 900 counselors would be covered, and the idea is not to say that technology is bad. Idea is to say, how can we use it responsibly? What are the dangers of using technology in terms of being exposed on certain sites? How can you protect yourself? And also how you can communicate better outside the digital area. And that's something that would be something that we have to do in future, because saying that technology doesn't work is going to be rejected outright by all the young people. What's your take on that, Dr. Helen?
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Sharma. We know the very important work and prominent work that you and your wife, Sujata, and colleagues are doing in a number of areas of community-based psychiatry and awareness. I think we're all posing the same question. What should we worry about? What should we not worry about? What should we be doing? What advice can we give? And I think one of the key understandings is we don't have the information at this point to give very clear advice. We can, as you say, make certain, there's certain things that have been recommended already about exposure to screen time for very young children, but even that's based on a fairly weak evidence base. It's more by extrapolation, argument by extrapolation. And we haven't yet defined, for instance, as Dr. Saha says, when a young person says, but I'm getting my notes and I'm reading my novel for school on my iPad, how do we undertake the research that defines screen time in appropriate ways that is longitudinal as well as cross-sectional? Most of the existing work, in fact, is cross-sectional, shows associations between mental health status of various types and various types of screen exposure. So we have a lot of work to do, but it's part of our job is to advocate for the importance of it, the importance of funding for research and activity in this way, and for useful initiatives.
Thank you very much, Helen, for this excellent overview. I would like to focus on another aspect of this whole issue. Apart from this digital era, affecting our relationships, social life, and so on, our habits and so on. Look, I'm trying to kind of think of how it's affecting our particularly cognitive development in children. What's happening is, what has been said by the chairpersons, that children now, from very early age, from the primary school, they are getting their kind of homework in the tablet or on the WhatsApp. Now, what's happening is again that writing is no more essential. They don't learn to write cursive. They don't have to. It's not essential. Mathematical computation, mental computation is not essential anymore, and so on. So I think what's happening is that it's affecting our biological evolution, the cognitive skills. I mean, cognitive skills that we needed 100,000 years ago, and the ones that we need now or will kind of evolve gradually through this transition and digital era are going to be extremely different, very different. Attention span, I mean, the multitasking is the rule rather than, now, sometimes, we used to say that children who are inattentive and they do multiple things simultaneously, and we would label them as ADHD, but on the other hand, this is what is happening, that it's essential and they are able to now do multiple tasks at the same time. So focused, persistent attention on a task does not happen. Children are not kind of showing this. So how it is going to affect eventually our brain development or our academic cognitive development and our social skills, the canvas is very wide and effects are far-reaching, not just limited to addiction or behavioral patterns, but much more.
Thank you very much, Savita. I think you've said it beautifully, that we don't know. And you and Baroness Greenfield in the UK, prominent neuroscientists, have drawn attention to the fact that we don't know in particular the effect on cognition, on attention span, that this is a very distracting environment for children and young people to be in. I think understand those kind of concerns are the basis of the recommendations to limit screen time, but at what age we should introduce screens and how, for what time, at what ages, nobody knows, to my understanding.
So, Helen, thank you for a comprehensive presentation. Particularly the bit around the vision for the future and citing Ajay as an example and how it can close the treatment gap. I feel it's too easy to get hung up on screen time. Like every generation has had a particular innovation or evolution which has engaged the limbic cortex. In my father's era, it was the radio. In my era, it was the television. In my son's era, it's the tablets. And after that, it will be virtual reality. So every era will have something like that. But technology does provide us, there's no point in arguing with the children about screen time because we would lose that argument because of all the things that Dr. Shah said and Dr. Singh said, that everything comes through the internet. So all that it gives rise to is conflict. And I have a 13-year-old and 11-year-old. And I often find myself, 4 of us sitting in a restaurant and all 4 of us on our mobiles. So if we ourselves aren't good role models for our children, we can't expect our children to act differently. So I think kind of charity begins at home, and if we can have lots of research on screen time, but perhaps we have to accept...
Absolutely, sir. I do agree with you because it is not the screen time only. It is the content which they are seeing.
Yeah.
So it will be
trying to control
balance like within these two things.
Yeah, I think trying to control it is not a battle that we are going to win. Perhaps we ought to embrace it and look at the positives that you kind of highlighted in your talk that might come with the technology.
Exactly, do agree. Sir, Dr. Bide. Last.
Can I say there are problems with technology? As long as patient is needed to taken to a center, and then only we can communicate, it's a problem. I'm from Australia. I've done huge amount of work in UK, then New Zealand and Australia. Now patients have to be taken by 2 staff to a video link place, and then only we can communicate. And what I'm trying to say, as long as psychiatrists not able to give their own private phone number to your patients, things will not happen what we want. Second thing that I've always done, I have based myself with GPs. All my life, I practiced not from the hospital, but from GP clinics. And that's the way you communicate or the way you link with community at large. Patients prefer to come to GPs than to a mental hospital 70 miles away. So we have to be a little bit forward thinking by basing yourself away from mental hospital, away from psych units, into community with GPs, and you indirectly teaching them and helping them. That's one. And number 2, you must have a second phone or third phone where a patient can directly reach you, whether it's Saturday, Sunday. In fact, to be honest, since I've been here, I have admitted 2 patients because I could communicate and they can communicate to me. My wife says in 40 years, I have received maybe 10 calls which should not have come to me. However, we only give in India our phone number if patient is private, not other one. So I think the whole thing has to change if you really wish to make use of your digital communication technology. Otherwise, you cannot reach 1.3 billion people with 6,000 psychiatrists in India. It will never happen.
Thank you, sir. The point well taken.
Thank you, Helen, for the wonderful, wide-ranging presentation. One observation and one question. The observation is that hikimori, a Japanese phenomenon, as you mentioned, well described in the Orient, more Oriental than India, so to say, is occurring quite commonly in urban India today. And these are usually people from the upper middle class or the upper classes who will not mix with the family, are completely withdrawn, quite often, but not always, sold on technology and quite tech savvy. But they will not share their tech savviness with their parents, much to their parents' distress. And they are otherwise seemingly intellectually normal. They don't necessarily absent themselves from school, but some cases do. And we're seeing this increasingly so. I have at least 7 cases with me right now. I may not have had more than 2 in the past 10 years prior to this. The second is the age at which the child can be exposed increasingly to the small screen. And you mentioned 2 years. I was given to understand from research, including neuroradiological evidence about cognitive impairment that Savita talked about, it should not be before 4 years. So I'd like a position statement on that.
Well, thank you for your very good observations. Thank you, Vinay. As to what age the exposure should be, I can't answer that. I think that's one of, and Savita was saying something similar, that the question about what are the effects on cognitive development and the positive or negative effects on that or on specific aspects of functioning, such as attention, I believe, but serve to be corrected by the neuroscientists or the child psychiatrists. As far as I understand, we don't know. But this seems a huge gap, doesn't it? And I'm also very interested to hear what you said about hikikomori, because we'd heard that within the northern Asian countries that it's spreading, but now that it's coming, you're seeing it more here. So this is a curious and important matter for us to think about as well. So thank you.
So it's a nice presentation, nice discussion. Everything is going really. So we should have a round of applause for Ma'am. And I want to conclude this session here. Over to Rajeshri.
Thank you, sir. A very fantastic plenary session, which we've all really learned, enjoyed, and shared our views and thoughts. And now it's my privilege to invite our chairpersons, Dr. Gautam Shaha and Dr. Professor O.P. Singh, to hand over a small token of appreciation and felicitation for our speaker, Professor Helen Herman. Thank you. May I now request Professor Ajit Bhire to come on stage and felicitate our chairpersons for this plenary. Dr. Bhire, please. Dr. Ajit Bhire, please. Ma'am, please wait. Ma'am, please wait for a photo session. A big round of applause for our chairpersons and the speaker for this afternoon plenary session on the 23rd of January.
We start our next session, which is on new treatments in depression. And our speaker is Dr. Malcolm Hopwood. And I would request Dr. Malcolm Hopwood to please come to the stage. And the chairpersons for this session is Dr. R.R. Ghosh Roy and Professor E. Mohan Das. So please come up to the stage. Thank you. So it's new treatments in depression.
Okay. Professor Hopwood graduated from University of Melbourne, gained Fellowship of PAN-CA in 1994, along with a Masters of Psychological Medicine from Monash University. At present, he is President of AFPA, past President of BANZCP, and Professor of University of Melbourne. May I request Professor Haput to deliver his speech.
Yep. So thank you very much for that kind introduction, and I'm very honoured to be presenting here as the President of the Asian Federation of Psychiatric Associations. So I thank the IPS for this invitation. For those of you who may not be so familiar with the Asian Federation of Psychiatric Associations, this is an organisation that brings together all of the psychiatric associations across South Asia, Central Asia, Oceania, North Asia. So by including Japan, China, India, and all of the other countries, collectively, we cover almost half of the world's population and bring to this challenge of working within psychiatry the enormous variation that exists across Asia. I also want to celebrate AFPA because I'm particularly excited to be able to tell you that the President-elect of AFPA is, of course, Prasad Rao from here in India. And we will be bringing the World Congress of Asian Psychiatry to this city in March next year. So I look forward to coming back and welcoming you all. In making a talk about new treatments in depression, I want to start with a particular point. In a way, what you think is a new treatment depends on what you currently have available. So sometimes when we talk about new treatments, we're talking about things that will only ever be available to a very small percentage of the Asian population. If currently, for example, you're in certain countries within Asia, you may at times have no antidepressant medication available at all. So what someone else may think of as a very old treatment may be new to you. So I think when we think about new treatments, we need that balance. In talking about new treatments, I would like to acknowledge that often involves research and funding from manufacturers of new treatments. So I acknowledge these potential conflicts of interest. Why should we talk about new treatments in depression? Many of you will be familiar with the findings from the Global Burden of Disease study that says depression is a prevalent condition throughout the world and by 2030 is estimated to become the leading cause of disability globally. I think it is very interesting to think about that as a challenge for us. How are we contributing to solving the worst and most burdensome disease in the world? I think when I compare with the status of the treatment of cancer when I started in medicine 30 years ago. 30 years ago in Australia, the diagnosis of cancer was seen as uniformly, always a very bad diagnosis. People feared the diagnosis and they feared the treatments. Is that similar to what we experience in psychiatry, that people fear our diagnoses and our treatments? The answer is, of course, yes, very much so. Cancer treatment, perhaps particularly in the Western world, has undergone an incredible transformation, a huge change over the last 2 to 3 decades. With better science, better treatments, and particularly better outcomes. So whenever we talk about evolution in the treatment of depression, I think we should take what they do and learn from it. In thinking about new treatments of depression then, we should set a baseline for what do we think is good basic treatment of depression. Here, I'm going to quote for the Australian and New Zealand College of Psychiatrists, CPG, about the treatment of mood disorders. Of course, there are local CPGs and there are many throughout Asia that vary. In Australia, and in New Zealand for that matter, we're in a fortunate position where we can talk about choice of treatment without too much of a financial consideration. So most medications are available in Australia. Psychotherapy is relatively freely available in Australia. And I understand that is certainly not the case everywhere. But in that environment, we were able to look in these guidelines at what we think is good treatment for depression. Very importantly, we talked about the goal of treatment of depression as being remission. Many of you will be familiar with the evidence that says half-treated depression has less than half as good an outcome. So our goal must be complete remission in all circumstances. In our guideline, we then talked about what we called step 0, up here. That involves looking at basic life circumstances for the person we're treating with depression. It is, for example, almost impossible to treat depression effectively in the setting of intense domestic violence. And until that is attended to, we are not going to be successful, or very unlikely to be successful. Similarly, if we are facing someone with an active substance abuse problem and so on. I think particularly across Asia, another issue that is commoner perhaps than in Australia is the influence of extreme poverty on rates of depression. And until we can address that better, it is interesting to know what overall impact we may have. Our guidelines then say something roughly similar to most developed nation guidelines, that the first step in the treatment of major depression is either, for mild to moderate depression, a structured psychotherapy or pharmacotherapy with an antidepressant. As the depression becomes more severe, our guidelines recommend antidepressants should definitely be part of the treatment. That's not so unusual. Many guidelines would recommend much the same thing. But what is interesting is how that works entirely depends on what's available. So you can see we've listed there a range of antidepressant medications. First line, second line, and later we talk about third line. Well, in Australia, they're all equally accessible. Is that true everywhere? The answer is, of course, not. Similarly, most of the evidence about the pharmacotherapies, and in particular the psychotherapies, has been accumulated in Western countries. So what is the applicability of evidence about cognitive behavioural therapy in the many cultures across Asia? It may make sense to a particular place and time in a Western society, but cognitive behavioural therapy does not work everywhere. Do we have sufficient evidence to say what would be an appropriate replacement? Our guidelines then talk about second-line choices for that approximately 60% of patients who don't get into remission with the first step. They talk about combining psychotherapy and pharmacotherapy, augmenting treatment with multiple medications. TMS is listed as a second-line option, and then ECT. So most of that is not particularly surprising, but it assumes each of those things is equally available, and that is not always true. So any discussion of new treatments has to start with an assumption that we have all of those things that we'd consider old, readily available. And it's interesting to reflect where that is true and where it is not. One of the commonest questions we're approached with as psychiatrists is how do we decide, in the medication side of things, where to go with our antidepressants? And I want to commend to you a particular body of work that many of you probably are already familiar with, the network meta-analysis produced by Andrea Cipriani in The Lancet in 2018. A huge network meta-analysis included around 120,000 subjects in over 500 randomised controlled trials. Huge. Of course, there are the assumptions involved in a network meta-analysis that randomised controlled trials are comparable. There is also the difficulty that we have far more information about some medications than others. So if you look at the top of these two diagrams, the size of the dot represents the number of randomised controlled trials with that medication, and the thickness of the bar, how many comparisons are available. The bottom graphic represents the same detail in terms of tolerability of antidepressants. The measures they were looking for in terms of outcome were response, which is generally, as many of you know, judged as 50% improvement in symptoms, whereas tolerability was measured as dropout from treatment due to presumed side effects. What did they find? The key finding that the authors described is that all of these 18 currently available antidepressants were superior to placebo in terms of efficacy. Well, that's a very good result. It was very interesting for me that, particularly in Australia, but also a little bit elsewhere in Asia, I did some media work when these results were released. The first question I was asked on Australian television about these results is, so, Professor Hopwood, do you now believe that antidepressants work? And inside me, a small voice was saying, what a very stupid question. Why are you asking this question? Thankfully, that voice stayed inside me and did not come out. That could have been embarrassing. But what I did say is, no, I'm not surprised by this result. I reflected later, why did the reporter ask me this question? And in many ways, the reporter is asking the question many of our patients ask. They don't necessarily believe our treatments work. They are suspicious of our treatments and often reject them, either by telling us they won't take them or actually they just don't tell us but don't take them anyway. So this is a very important study that reinforces, no, they do work and we should use this information well. Often we look at these graphs and say, well, which one was the most effective? It's actually quite interesting. Up the top is an old antidepressant, amitriptyline. Now, of course, we wouldn't necessarily recommend that for treatment because of the tolerability and toxicity issues. But the authors chose not to highlight the differences, rather the fact that they were all effective. There were differences between the drugs in terms of dropout rate. That is true, and that's relevant to our considerations. What does this say to us in terms of the standard of care and new treatments? It tells us that we have at least some of these in most countries across Asia, a range of available antidepressants that can work. It says maybe which ones are available isn't as important as the fact that at least some are. Our choices then may be based on acceptability and dropout, but any discussion of new treatments must begin with availability from this group of compounds. I'm going to talk about what I think then is the next most important step in the development of better treatment of depression. One of our major problems in psychiatry is that we all know our patients don't always do what we'd like them to do. Now, of course, all of my patients take all of the medication I prescribe. It's all the other doctors that are causing the problem. We all think that, don't we? But we all have the same problem, that we recommend treatments and we know that patients do not adhere. And we actually look at the data about non-adherence to antidepressants in Australia. It's very similar to other countries where it's been measured, that at 1 month after the initial prescription, already 40% of patients are not taking that medicine. They're not even getting it from the pharmacist. And by 3 months, it's well over half. We're not doing very well. There are probably many reasons for this, and it may be that if we had better medicines, that would help too, one could argue. But does it also tell us something about how we discuss our treatments with our patients? So a proposed approach to this is the idea of shared decision making, and there are various terms that are used in this area. And the essence of the approach is where decisions about treatment are very much joint decisions involving you and the patient. I'll come to some evidence in a minute that this actually works, but it is a shift in the nature of the relationship. Now, I've talked about this in a number of parts of Asia, and people often say to me a few things. How do I reach a decision together with a patient when I have to see maybe 30 patients in 1 hour? It's very difficult to have a long conversation to reach a joint decision. Well, part of this process is ensuring that the patient has adequate information to express their choice, and they can be getting that information before they come into the room to see you. It doesn't have to be solely when they're with you. I would also suggest that if you invest time well in this process, the chances are you won't need to see this patient for as long in the future. You will ultimately be more efficient. Where did this idea first come from? Actually, from that specialty I mentioned before, oncology. So many of you will remember, I think some of you trained at a similar time to me, how a discussion with many patients about radiotherapy or cytotoxic agents for the treatment of cancer, patients were very scared of these treatments. Oncology increasingly has engaged in a shared decision-making process. Not perfectly, I don't think that's true, and I think we can learn from that. If we help the patient have a choice in their treatment for depression, that sounds very nice and democratic. Does it really make a difference? It's all very good. This is a very simple study. It's about 8 or 9 years old now, from Taiwan. The idea of this study is patients with major depression were randomised to either receive psychotherapy or antidepressant medicine. It's not a very complicated study, really. And the main result of the study was if they had mild to moderate major depression, after 8 weeks of treatment, the outcomes were equal for both of those treatments. And that's probably not a surprise to many of you familiar with this literature. But before they received the treatment, patients were asked, which one would you like to have? They didn't get their choice, they were randomised. But at the end of the study, they looked at how well you did if you got the treatment you wanted versus if you didn't get the treatment you wanted. And there was a significant difference between those who were matched to the treatment and those who were mismatched. In terms of the Hamilton rating scale, the difference between the group who got what they wanted and those who didn't was about 4 points on the Hamilton. For those who are familiar with the Hamilton, you will know that's usually the difference between active drug and placebo. So getting your choice made almost as much difference again as whatever the treatment itself was. Powerful evidence, I think, that getting what you want is more likely to succeed. How do we know what is likely to influence patients' choice of treatment? These are the results of an audit done in Australia of patients attending primary care doctors, GPs, in Australia. For those who are not familiar with the Australian healthcare system, about 80% of depression in Australia is treated by primary care doctors, which is a very big help because even though we feel like we've got a lot of psychiatrists, we haven't got enough for all the people with depression, and I'm sure the same is true here, a lot more so, I'm sure. This study asked patients who are about to take antidepressant treatment a number of questions about what were their main concerns. Some of this writing may be a little hard to read from the back, I understand. What was very interesting, the main concerns patients had about taking an antidepressant were about side effects. 80% of them were worried about side effects. Down here, under 20% were worried it wouldn't work. Now, isn't that interesting? Because when we choose a treatment, I think 80% of our thinking is, will it work? And 20% of our thinking is about side effects. We choose differently to our patients. So we need to learn, if that's the way patients are thinking, we need to be working with their choices. In particular, which side effects or issues were they worried about? Now, these are Australian patients. Their worries might be different to patients elsewhere in Asia. That's absolutely true. But the commonest worries were, I'm going to become addicted to this medicine, that it will change my personality or make me a zombie, that I'll be stigmatised for taking it, and a little bit about cost, but not so much. When we asked them more specifically about other side effects, their number one side effect worry was weight gain. We often think with many of the newer antidepressants that's not too bad, not like the tricyclics, but patients are worried about it. I would suggest that if in the discussion with them and reaching a choice, we address their concerns, we may actually achieve a much better outcome. To move then to what are the new treatments. So none of this matters unless we've talked about what good existing treatments should be, and they're available. Certainly in an Australian context, and I know from my work with an Asian advisory board in a number of other countries in Asia, the next major pharmacological treatment for depression is going to be related to ketamine. Many of you are aware that there's been a literature at least 10 years old now about the use of sub-anaesthetic doses of ketamine to help with treatment-resistant depression. With challenging evidence originally from NIMH, Carlos Zarate in the US, that talks about response in over half the patients with treatment-resistant depression within a few hours. This information has challenged us about, so do we give this treatment once and then start a conventional treatment? Is it something we give repeatedly? Do we give it long term? How do we manage the fact that in some areas of Asia, ketamine is a major drug of abuse? At one point in Hong Kong, ketamine was the number one drug of abuse. We clearly want to be careful of creating a problem. Some of you will be aware that ketamine, of course, is a drug that's been off patent for many, many years. So a major trial program with ketamine itself has always been a bit unlikely. Janssen-Cilag have developed esketamine, the intranasal form of an isomer of ketamine. That is now commercially available in the United States. It has recently been approved by the European Medicines Authority, and I think it is likely to become available in a number of countries through Asia over the next 2 to 3 years. I obviously don't know that for sure, but I think that's very likely, including Australia. What is the evidence about this new drug and where might it fit? So there is a series of trials of this new drug, and I don't want to go over all the details. The original trials were looking at a fixed dose treatment over a period of 4 weeks. So not just one dose, but over 4 weeks, where patients were put on esketamine plus a new antidepressant or placebo plus a new antidepressant. And this showed that there was a rapid response to esketamine compared to placebo, and you can see it there within 2 days, and that the difference from placebo was maintained over 4 weeks. Good. This is a treatment in treatment-resistant depression. So these are patients who've all failed at least 2 previous medication treatments. The STAR-D study would say if we get patients to take treatment, about a half of the patients with major depression will be treatment resistant, depending upon where you are, possibly even more. And previously, we've not really had treatments that have been proven to work specifically for treatment-resistant depression. You could argue that some of the work with TMS is in treatment-resistant depression, and undoubtedly some of the work with ECT is, even though it wasn't designed that way. Here's a new treatment with very positive-looking results that I think will be exciting. Not all studies were positive. I think that's very important to acknowledge. Very importantly, this is a drug that is associated with some significant side effects at the time of its use, particularly dissociation, which we know can be seen when it's used as an anaesthetic, and post-dose hypertension in a small group of patients. That's meant that in the countries it's available, it's a drug that has to be given in a clinic where a patient can be observed for up to 2 to 3 hours post-dose. Immediately that means there are many parts of Asia where that is going to be an immense practical barrier to its use, let alone the issues of cost of the drug and so on. But where we're talking about a huge limit of workforce, are we going to have our nurses sitting in a clinic observing patients after a dose of this drug when our nurses are so precious to us? That's a very difficult question, I think. However, if we were saying what is the range of treatments we would like to have available in every country in Asia, ideally, I think in 5 years' time we will be saying we would like to have this treatment available. I think that will be the case. One of the questions we still don't really know is most of our currently available treatments for depression, if we think they work, we recommend they be continued long-term, with most guidelines suggesting after an episode of major depression, if you found an antidepressant that works, you should stay on the same dose for 1, 2 or more years, depending upon how many episodes you've had. What about a drug like this that acts quickly? Should you stay on that long term? This is a standard trial looking at patients who got into remission, so got well on esketamine, then half of them were randomised to continue on placebo and half of them on the active drug. And those of you who are familiar in looking at these survival curves will see that the patients who continued on esketamine versus placebo, more of the patients on esketamine remained in remission over up to an 85-week period, so almost 2 years. The study was discontinued at that point because there was an observable difference between the active drug and placebo. So it does suggest we should be continuing this. How many of our patients would like to come back to a clinic weekly for 85 weeks? Even if they would like to, how many of them can? And can they afford it? And can they get there? Very challenging questions for us, very challenging. One of the answers should lie with all our treatments in what is the cost of them not doing that. So for those patients who stop their treatment for depression, how much does that ultimately cost them and us as a community? If you think that by the time you've had your third episode of depression, your risk of having another one in the next 5 years is probably well over 85%, stopping your treatment has a very significant impact. So we need to balance these costs carefully, even though at first they might seem impossible to imagine. I wanted to share with you some more recent data that follows a very interesting and I think important story. The investigators who looked at intravenous ketamine consistently made a comment that they felt it was particularly helpful for patients who had marked suicidality. Now clearly, effective treatment of the suicidal patient is one of the things we would all like to achieve. And very few treatments in psychiatry have actually demonstrated clear effects in reducing suicidality. Lithium and clozapine are arguably the only two. So, Janssen-Seelig decided with esketamine they would do what I think was a very brave thing. These two studies looked at patients with major depression and active suicidal ideation. These are the patients we see every day who usually don't get into clinical trials, and yet we'd really like to know how to treat them, right? What they offered these patients was a combination of things. All of the patients were put into hospital. Now, it'd be nice to be able to do that, wouldn't it? Always with everyone with active suicidal ideas. All of them were started on a new antidepressant, and again, half of them received esketamine and half of them placebo. So that's a complicated study, isn't it? And immediately picking out an effect is going to be complex when you're doing multiple things. Just to emphasise how unwell these patients were, if you're familiar with the Montgomery-Asberg rating scale for depression, their mean score was 42, which if you know that scale, that's a very unwell group of patients, much sicker than you usually get into clinical trials, where the mean would be down in the 20s. What did they find? So this is the people who got into the study, and if you look at who they are, they're not necessarily treatment resistant now. So they could just be on their first antidepressant. So it is a slightly different group. And you can see they recruited quite large numbers given the challenge in this study. At baseline, as I said, their mean MADRS score was over 40. And the groups had significant suicidality. So you can see, if you look in the left-hand column, for example, at those who were either markedly or severely suicidal, we're talking about 60%. So these are very unwell patients. Many of them had attempted suicide before in their life, not surprisingly, and quite a high proportion, about a quarter, had attempted suicide within the last month. These are patients we'd clearly like to be able to help. The study found two very interesting things. Number one, despite hospitalising everyone and giving them a new antidepressant, esketamine was still better for their depression than placebo. So there was still enough of an effect to see that. Well, that's good. But what happened to suicidality? Now, this is a complicated graph to look at. If I can just explain, over here on the right-hand side, at the bottom of this scale is the lowest level of suicidality, right up to the highest level of suicidality. And each colour represents a grade up of suicidality. Oops. Let me just go back. Beg your pardon. you can see that we're comparing the placebo and esketamine groups. And ultimately, there was no difference between the two groups in improvement in suicidality. Why? Because almost everyone became less suicidal. Now, when I was with this advisory board, I congratulated Janssen because I think they'd done a study that we've been waiting many years to see. I think what this study shows is that admitting people to hospital who are intensely suicidal actually does improve things. Now, often we struggle to be able to do that, don't we? But I think this study supports strongly that actually it's a useful thing to do. And esketamine may be an important part of their treatment. But I think the study shows that it's not common, is it, that when we're treating depression, we do just one thing. In fact, it's virtually never the case. So in judging new treatments, we have to think carefully, what's the context? How are we going to use them and where do they fit? So, if we gave esketamine to suicidal patients who weren't in hospital, would it be useful? I don't know. Deep down, I would be worried about doing that. And I think that's an important comment, because particularly when psychiatric beds are very difficult to access, you know, and we know that's true in so many parts of Asia, there will be pressure to use new treatments like this that might reduce suicidality on an outpatient basis. And I think we need to be careful. Whilst we want new treatments, the bad use of new treatments can ruin their reputation very quickly. So we need to think about practical use of new treatments. What's likely to happen with this drug? Well, I've mentioned already that in Australia, I think it is likely this drug will become available to us, although I have no control over that, but within the next year or two at the most. And I think it's likely that will be so in other parts of Asia. It's likely it will be targeted towards people with treatment-resistant depression, and that would be the first treatment in Australia and in most countries in Asia that's specifically listed for treatment-resistant depression. We will need close monitoring of patients. I think that regulators in all countries will want that, I think, which practically means we'll need clinics to provide this, perhaps as is consistent with some other new treatments like TMS as an example. And indeed, I think there may well be some of the same providers do both, even. We may see that emerge. What else is out there that may become regularly available soon or not? I particularly like showing this slide because it's probably the only time in my life I will ever show anything involving Fox News. I can't think of another reason for me to do that. But it is a very interesting presentation of information. Some of you may have heard of a compound called brexanolone. It's a synthetic steroid that actually chemically is similar to progesterone. It acts in the brain as what's called a neurosteroid. It influences GABA receptors in the brain, it's a modulator, and also probably works on progesterone receptors. Because of its GABA action, there is reason to think it may be useful as an anxiolytic and also an antidepressant. Because it has this progesterone-like action, of course there is reason to think, could this drug be useful in situations like postpartum depression or perimenopausal depression, where we've often thought that hormonal factors might be very relevant, although we've struggled to find hormonal treatments that have actually been effective. So there was a series of trials in the US that demonstrated it was effective in severe postpartum depression. Well, very good. But there is a practical problem. This drug is only available as an intravenous infusion that you have over 8 hours. And as Fox News informs us, that treatment the drug alone will cost $35,000. I don't think we're going to be seeing this in most parts of Asia anytime soon. Very interestingly, my immediate thought on hearing the news about this new drug is, well, that's completely impractical. That night I was at dinner with some friends, most of whom didn't work in health at all, and I just talked about this new drug. And a woman who was sitting next to me said, "Mal, just after I had my baby, if someone gave me a drug that gave me 8 hours sleep, I'd pay $1 million for it." I thought maybe I missed the point. But this is not going to be an available drug. Are there others under development that might be in this space? And the answer is yes. Some of you may have heard of an American company called Sage, who are focusing on developing treatments using this mechanism. These are oral medications. And interestingly, with their 217 compound, so it's still early phase development, we can see that they're getting a similar early response. Not a few hours, but within a few days. Now, we've seen many results with new treatments of depression in early phase that don't get borne out. So it will be quite right to greet this with scepticism. But if there is a new mechanism that I think treatments will become available, it will be this. What we don't know in thinking about where a new treatment like this fits across Asia is how much is it going to cost? Will it be better than what I've already got? Or should I reserve it for people who don't get better? Is it more important for me to think about buying this new drug or hiring more resources like therapists to work in my clinic? I think when we look at expensive new treatments, we really need to be involved in a hard, rational exercise, don't we? I've put up this slide just to highlight something that I think is relevant to considering new treatments for depression. These studies look at the addition of L-methylfolate to antidepressant treatment for major depression. Many of you will know there's a very old story about relative folate deficiency being frequent in patients with depression, but the addition of oral folate unfortunately not proving to be very helpful. It would be good if it was, because actually folate's quite cheap. It would be great. L-methylfolate probably penetrates the blood-brain barrier better. And in these studies, at least in a higher dose, the 15 milligram dose, it seemed to boost the action of SSRIs. It makes sense to use it that way because most of you will know part of the production of serotonin in the brain is dependent on the one carbon cycle that folate influences. Part of the point I want to make here, in terms of investment in new treatments in depression, we have very large industries who work around new medications. But those medications that come, if you like, from a natural medicine background, it is harder to develop the level of evidence we'd really like. That may lead us to be sceptical about their value, although we should be aware because many of our patients see them as extremely valuable, without a shadow of a doubt. So in Australia, patients with depression spend more on natural medicines than they do on, if you like, the standard proprietary medications. Patients like them. So going back to shared decision making, we shouldn't ignore them. How do we develop a level of evidence for them that would make us comfortable with using them? I think this is a challenge for all of us. I had the pleasure yesterday of attending a workshop here about neuromodulation and hearing about some of the exciting techniques that people were employing, looking at robotic TMS and all sorts of things, which was terrific. I did wonder how that applied across the country, just a little bit. But we should think about new developments for treatments that we know are effective. Many of you will be familiar with the move to improve ECT, which remains the most effective treatment we have for severe major depression. And with the move to unilateral ultra-brief ECT is now a very different treatment to that most of us grew up with. It still, of course, has the highest level, I think, of stigma amongst all our treatments, and that's a major problem for us to overcome. One of the treatments that was discussed at the neuromodulation workshop was FEAST, a new potential form of ECT that uses a very focused beam of current and therefore may induce a very local rather than generalised seizure. And if you can do that in the relevant areas of the brain but spare others, cognitive side effects may be even less than unilateral ultra-brief ECT. I don't think we yet know whether that will prove to be as effective a treatment. So we're quite right to be cautious in wild uptake, but there is no doubt in my mind that ECT should remain available for everyone with severe major depression. Again, this may be a little hard to read from the back, but I want to explain why I put it up. So when we talk about new treatments in major depression, there is always, it's fascinating, isn't it, to talk about new treatments. New science, very exciting, new gadgets, very appealing. Sometimes that appeal can be so exciting that we don't pause to be critical enough about the evidence. Some of you will have witnessed some of the media around the use of deep brain stimulation in psychiatry, a replacement for old lesion-based psychosurgery where you implant stimulating electrodes deep in the brain. And there were these, it's widely used, as you know, in the treatment of Parkinson's disease. And there was a push to use it in the treatment of depression and obsessive compulsive disorder, including a program in my home state of Victoria. Eventually, one of the challenges in this kind of work is how do you do a randomised controlled trial? Because it's an implantable device, if you've got it in. You can turn it off for a while, but that's not quite the same, is it, as a proper randomised controlled trial? Eventually, the commonest operation, and interestingly, the operation was patented by the manufacturers of one of the device, a subthalamic operation, there was a good systematic review of did it actually produce good outcomes. The answer for obsessive compulsive disorder that's severe is pretty clearly yes, actually. The answer for major depression is reasonably clearly no, except sometimes. Why could that be? One could hypothesise it's because major depression is such a heterogeneous disorder. So the idea there's going to be a single site that an operation would always prove helpful would seem optimistic. Whereas I think many authorities would feel the neurocircuitry of severe OCD is probably a little more consistent. This is not a procedure that would ever be available to anything but a tiny minority of patients with major depression across Asia. Tiny minority. But providing it to a very small minority could take a lot of resource. Is that a good thing to do? Well, the results would say no. So the cautionary tale here is we need to be very careful about adopting new treatments just because they're new. It doesn't automatically mean they are going to make a big difference to our patients' lives. I don't wish to suggest, by the way, that investigations into this technique in major depression should stop. I think it will continue, and who knows, hopefully one day we will get there. I wanted to close then with a recent experience I had again in my home state of Victoria. We're currently having a royal commission into mental health in my state. Some of you are familiar with that pattern of inquiry. It's the highest level of inquiry that a government in Australia can initiate. It has all sorts of powers to call witnesses and subpoena. And this is a very high-profile inquiry into the performance of mental health services in Victoria. So appearing before it as a witness is a slightly intimidating thing, but an opportunity nevertheless to talk about what you think is needed. Even in a country as wealthy as Australia, patients with major depression often struggle to get access to specialist treatment for major depression unless they are privately insured or well off. There is, in my view, an imbalance there. How do we address that within the resources we have? And that those resources are certainly thinner than Australia's in many parts of Asia. How can we not address that when we're talking about the number one cause of disability globally? That's, in my view, inexcusable. Many of the barriers to fixing that are around legislation, funding, and service design. So talking about new treatments in depression doesn't make any sense unless you're also talking about these things. Because our new treatments will never be applied in a logical manner unless they're in a service system that can support that. And getting that right is just as important as anything else we can do. So in summary, I want to suggest to you that major depression should be viewed as our top priority. Because if we don't do so, and it continues to be the leading cause of disability globally, we're not doing our job. We kind of have felt quite good about the fact that the global burden of disease said amongst the top 20 causes, 5 of them are mental illnesses. Actually, that's not good. We're not succeeding, are we? So we have to push to systematically apply both our existing treatments and new treatments of major depression well. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Malcolm Hopwood, for your lucid presentation. Hand over this mic to my fellow colleague, Dr. E. Mohandas, for summary.
Yeah, Hopwood, it was a good presentation. Please come. Good presentation. For the audience, I will just make a capsule what he has done. He started with the Royal and Australian New Zealand guidelines snapshot. Then he talked about Cipriani's your network analysis with all lacunae, because there you will see mirtazapine as a good thing. I will not comment on all this thing. Then he went on to talk on specifically ketamine, and he quoted transform 1, 2, 3, then sustain 1, then aspire 1 and 2. These are the studies that he has put on. And he mentioned that is intranasal ketamine, and that is already US FDA approved on March 5th, 2019. Then he talked about brexanolone, postpartum depression, parentally given. That is also approved in March 2019. Then he talked about the GABA-A steroid palm, that is called SAGE 217. Isn't so? That you talked about it. Then after that, he has talked about the L-methyl folate. We have used the L-methyl folate, etc. Now, then he has talked about some of the feast that you talked. Then he has told one of the recent reviews which has come in behavior research, the February issue, on the DBS targets. That much he has talked. And the focus is basically on ketamine, basically. And the others. And I even wondered, Hopwood would have talked about rapastinel and epimustinal. Rapastinel and epimustinal, that is now coming up, and also cariprazine. In May 2019, it is also US FDA approved for even depression. Now, this is a summary. You will have enough questions. The expert is here, but only thing is that
3 questions, because Ghoshroy is there. After 3 questions, you can discuss with him outside.
So the session is open for question or comment. Due to constraint of time, only 3 persons will be allowed. Question or comment should be brief. Please.
Thank you, Dr. Hapwood. I'm Dr. Charles Estibero. I presently work in Australia, but I've done lots of public institution work in India. And there, when a person, and I'm sure many psychiatrists working in public institutions in India will probably agree, when they come with active, acute suicidal ideation and distress, I think ECG jumps all the hoops and becomes number 1. While in Australia, it is still, we have to go to step 1 and step 2 and step 3 and take tribunal permission and jump all those hoops. While practically in India, we solve it with a course of 8 or 10 ECTs. So I was wondering whether, we should gather this data and see if ECT deserves a much more priority in our hierarchy of approaching acute suicidal ideation. That's one. And second is low-dose brexpiprazole we have tried in New South Wales with very encouraging results. So just wanted your experience and comments on that.
Yeah, thank you for 2 very good questions. I think you're quite right about ECT, that it is perhaps, with the exception of clozapine, unusual in our treatments that the timing of its use is determined by things other than evidence. And it's often about patient and family fear of the treatment as much as the evidence of where it's going to work. And I accept your observation that in Australia, ECT is often not used urgently because of that fear when it could be very useful. Having said that, we don't have many other treatments that have rapid onset of action. And even with ECT, many patients won't show a response until they've had at least 3, 4, 5 treatments. So the newer treatments do seem to act quicker. So they are at least a potential alternative to ECT in that setting. I would love us to develop evidence that took a group of acutely unwell patients and randomised them to these choices. But I think this would be a very difficult study to get up and get done. Yeah.
Even the oral ketamine will come to India, but it is very costly. So here, pressing the button in acute depression is still followed, whether they agree or not, because ECT is the best antidepressant.
I'm aware. Across Asia, there are, of course, enormous variations in how people and families approach care. And clearly in any clinical practice guideline, it needs to have local context and acknowledgement. However, the challenge then is the evidence we draw upon doesn't often have local context, does it? Evidence often tends to come from a limited range of places. It would be good to develop more. Just to answer your second question and a comment about the use of atypical antipsychotics in the augmentation of major depression. And there are a group now who have evidence in the augmentation of major depression. And they are undoubtedly a useful treatment. Quetiapine, olanzapine, cariprazine you mentioned, and brexpiprazole you mentioned as well. Yeah, no, it's not approved for that use in Australia either. It is in the United States, where of course the use of aripiprazole was much more common in augmenting major depression as well. I think these are useful agents. I probably didn't focus on them because I'm not sure they're radically new. I think if you ask psychiatrists who've been around for a long time, they've known that for some patients, adding an antipsychotic can be very helpful. I don't think it's new news.
I have a quick question. Well, regarding your study where you gave the depressed patients the option of choosing their own treatment, psychotherapy or pharmacotherapy. Did you look at the severity of depression, so mild, moderate depression, or severe? Because in mild or moderate depression, psychotherapy may work as good as the pharmacotherapy. But if it is severe depression, then it's basically pharmacotherapy. Did you look at it?
Yeah, no, it's a very good question. The study, I should acknowledge, was not mine. It was a Taiwanese study, and most of the patients in it were probably mild to moderate, so your point is a very good one. Of course, if you speak to some experts in the evidence around psychotherapy, they would say psychotherapy can still be effective in severe depression. But there is a problem. What they define as severe depression and what you and I define as severe depression are very, very different things. So your comment is right. What decision-making means is relative to severity. But I would say even a severely depressed patient, in my view, will benefit from a good explanation of the options and why you are recommending. Just because they may not be in as good a position to make a decision doesn't mean they don't value the information.
Thank you.
Sir, I'm Dr. Pradeep Patil from Nagpur. We have got certain group of patients in which these suicidal thoughts, they are the reaction to some particular situation, not disorder per se, but what should be our strategy and what are your comments, globally, how to handle this situation, like reaction to some particular situation, those ideas remain for some particular period of time only.
Look, I think it's a very good point. So suicidality is an important symptom of major depression, and major depression in almost all studies is the commonest psychiatric morbidity associated with suicide. But suicidality does occur in lots of other situations. Bipolar disorder, alcohol dependence, and as you described, situations in life. And none of the evidence we've discussed looks at groups other than major depression. So we should be extremely careful in drawing any conclusions. I think it's a concern if we apply treatments across situations thoughtlessly, and we risk exposing people to harms for no potential benefit. So I think the point is very well made.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. We already declared we will take 3 persons only. No, sorry, please interact it personally with him. He will be available here. Don't worry. So the session is concluded now.
Thank you, Dr. Hopwood, for an excellent presentation. And I would request the chairpersons to please felicitate Dr. Hopwood. I would request Senior Psychiatrist Dr. Rima Mukherjee to come to the stage to felicitate our chairpersons. Dr. Rima Mukherjee.
I would like to call upon stage our symposium speakers, Dr. Sujit, Dr. Lakshmi Vijay Kumar, and Dr. Shubhangi Parker on the topic of government policies and the suicide prevention in India. And I would like to invite our honorable chairpersons, Dr. Indrajit Sen Gupta and Russell Karim. Dr. Russell Karim. Rizaul Karim, please come up on stage for chair a session.
Intro speakers.
Science.
Who is this presenting? Speakers? Shubhangi.
Photo different title.
Young photos. Shubhangi. So let's shut up please. 20 minutes, no?
Good evening, everybody. Though at the fag of the session, we are already fatigued, but still, due to the presence of three eminent speakers regarding suicide, you are present. Thank you for that. We are having Dr. Shubhangi Parker, who doesn't need an introduction. Dr. Lakshmi Vijay Kumar, who is an authority of the international, from India. She's the authority of international suicide prevention and suicidality, and my young friend, Dr. Sujit Sarkar, associate professor, and he's also very much famous for his own works regarding this aspect. So I request Dr. Shubhangi Parker to start the session. Let's start the session.
I would like to just give a very brief introduction after my honorable chairperson. Actually, we all three, under the leadership of Dr. Shubhangi Parker, she is the chairperson of the Suicide Prevention Committee of Specialty Section of IPS. Lakshmi ma'am, who is going to speak first, is the co-chairperson and I am the convener. We three have been working. Lakshmi ma'am is also the representative of WHO Southeast Asian region for suicide, and she has also been working in this area with the help of Sneha, the NGO which she has founded. She will begin the symposium by the basic heading of the symposium is government policies and suicide prevention, specifically referring to Indian government policies. So first, Lakshmi madam will start by highlighting how Indian government policies can impact the media and what changes have been brought and what changes are necessary to reduce the negative influence of media reporting of suicide and rather highlight the positive aspect. This will be followed by Shubhangi ma'am speaking about substance abuse and suicide, an area in which she has actively worked upon. And I shall finally conclude the session by highlighting the legal changes that have been brought in Indian laws and how it can help in reducing suicide and what more changes are necessary. I hand over to Lakshmi ma'am to start the ball rolling. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And sincerely thank the IPS and the subsection for inviting me and asking me to give this talk. So before going about what actually the Indian government has done, I think it is important to know why media matters so much in suicide. And yeah, the first, we all know about the Werther effect, which starts from Goethe's book, The Sorrows of Young Werther. And see, this was a book written by Goethe, and then in this book, it describes a young man who shoots himself because he failed in love. And subsequently, there were 48 young men all over Europe who died using the same method, many of them having this book in one hand or book in the same place. So it became known as the Werther effect, and this was coined actually by an American psychologist who worked at the influence of media on suicide, and particularly after the suicide of Marilyn Monroe. There were so many suicides, so he started looking at it and he coined the term. Since then, we have had many, I won't go too much into the history of all the, is it moving? So why does media impact so much on suicide? The fact is, there are three reasons why media has such an impact on suicide. One is, of course, based on the social learning theory that you see somebody solving their life problem by suicide, and so when you have a similar problem, you end up doing the same thing. Or you do it by a process of identification. You identify with the character, you identify with that person, you identify with that politician, you identify with the sports person, and then you do that. And it also happens more when there is an increased what is known as a suicidogenic mood in the society, which kind of encourages you to do that. So there have been many studies, and this is a meta-analysis which looks at whether media really has an impact, because media has always fought and saying that you can't really say it is the media which prompted suicide, because thousands of people look at our news, thousands of people read our papers. Only a few people die by suicide. So it is that person's individual vulnerability which has pushed that person to suicide. So you can't blame the media on that. But we have there have been more than 60, 70 studies which have looked at it and found out that media does have an impact on suicide, and you can see that in this meta-analysis. So we have studies based on newspapers, television, books, internet, mixed media, and totally. And now we have 97 studies which have shown that sensational portrayal of suicide in the media has a direct impact on suicide. And this is a classic example which happens in Hong Kong. If you follow the blue line there, I don't know, you just follow the blue line till light blue line, till 1998, you don't find anything, right? In 1998, in Hong Kong, there was a young person who died by suicide by using charcoal burning. He used charcoal to die by suicide, which was sensationally written by all the Chinese media, local media, television. And within a week, there was another person who also used the same method for suicide. And that also generated a huge media impact. And within 5 years, if you can see in 2003, the little blue line has come up to top and became the second most common method of suicide. So this is a clear indication where media has reported on a particular type of suicide, and that suicide has spread really like wildfire to become the second most common method of suicide in the entire Hong Kong. And not only that, it spread to Taiwan, and in Taiwan also it has become the second most common method of suicide. So of youngsters here would know that the Netflix series 13 Reasons Why has caught the imagination of many people, where it is 13 episodes where the young girl says why she wants to end by her suicide, and the last episode has a graphic description of how she dies by suicide. And as suicidologists, we all made a hue and cry, and some of the scenes were removed. And what you can see now is that how much the 13 Reasons Why has increased the suicide in young people. And there have been evidence that about 60% of these people who have used the same method have seen the Netflix series of 13 Reasons Why. And you can see the difference is in the process of identification. As you can see in the slide, you see that it is more the young girls who have used the method. They have identified with that character and they have died by suicide. Celebrity suicides, all these celebrity suicides in India, we have had, following that, we have had huge amount of suicides. And then, of course, we know the Robin Williams suicide. And since then, there has been a 10% increase in people in that age group of men between 30 and 44. And again, this meta-analysis on celebrity suicide, media reporting of celebrity suicides, so shows how much celebrity suicide have an impact in the increase of suicides in the world. And we have, so we assessed actually the quality of reporting of suicides in Tamil Nadu with Greg Armstrong, an Australian friend. And this is actually published in the Australian and New Zealand Journal of Psychiatry. And we identified about 2,300 suicide articles and rated them on how much they have complied with the WHO guidelines, and it is quite pathetic. I'll just rush through the slides, but it goes to show that 86% of it is in the main section, okay? And the fact is, description is of the method is explicit in about 75%, and let me go through this. The potential helpful thing is only about 6%, and mention of a suicide prevention program or support services is only in 3.6%. So over 85% of suicide reporting has been totally non-compliant with the WHO guidelines. Now, we always blame the media, but the media also has an important protective effect. Media can also be used to improve suicide rate, and that is called the Papageno effect. Papageno is a character in Mozart's Magic Flute, and he wants to die by suicide, and then the friend comes and talks him out of it. So how media can protect suicide is now known as the Papageno effect. And this is the study based on the how a person identify based on movies called The Night Mother. And then this is a very interesting thing, because in Vienna there used to be a lot of what is known as the subway suicide. Many youngsters will go on these Viennese subways, and when the subway train goes, they'll die. And there has been a huge increase in the number of Viennese subway suicides. So the psychiatrists in Vienna, Sonek and Esther Roffers and all those people, got all the media together and talked to them and said, please do not describe or write about subway suicide in the magazines and newspapers. And you can see, since then, the suicides, Viennese subway suicide has decreased drastically. And this is a phenomenal work done by Thomas Niederkorten-Thaler from Vienna, where he classified the suicide stories and found that stories in which they saw a person in crisis and a person is able to solve the crisis effectively, has reduced suicidal ideas. Whereas stories where they say, okay, the person has attempted suicide, has an increased amount of suicidal ideation. But when they show that you are able to master the crisis, even a person who is suicidal, their suicidal ideas comes down. In Chennai, we know that we have, in our country, we have a lot of people students who die because of, they have failed in exams. And every year, about 2,500 students die by suicide. So actually, with the active involvement of the media, for almost 1 week, we had a media campaign and wrote to the government of India, government of Tamil Nadu. And in 2003, they formulated we found out that students who died by suicide had failed in 1 or 2 subjects by a few marks. So we highlighted this research finding, and the media also helped us enormously. And Tamil Nadu government was the first government to introduce the supplemental exams for students who have failed in class 10 and class 12, so that they could write the exam within 1 month and not lose an academic year. And you can see that there has been almost a 50% reduction in suicide in Tamil Nadu since then, from the year 2004 to now, and in spite of an increasing number of students. And you can see that in Chennai it is much reduced because probably the sources of help is more. Then the other issue with media is they are the reason which starts suicide hotspots. If a particular suicide or 1 or 2 suicides happens in the same spot, it becomes a suicide hotspot. And this is what happened in Chennai. It's a bridge which is very close to my place, and one singer's husband jumped over the bridge during the Madras music season, and the papers went to town about it. And if you can look at the report, in that 1 year, it happened in 2010 to 2014, there were 10 suicides. So since then, we had asked the media not to report. You want to report suicide, you report it, but don't mention the Kottapuram Bridge. Don't mention that this is what has happened. Remove the stigma of the suicide spot. And we also spoke to the government and raised the barrier in the bridge. And since 2014 till about now, there has been only 1 suicide. So it is possible to change. So what are the guidelines? See, the guidelines as such are, many of us talk about the don'ts of the guidelines, we don't talk about what needs to be done. One is, we have to take the opportunity to educate the public about suicide. And of course, we all know that no sensationalizing, normalizing, presenting it as a solution to problems. Definitely no description of the method of suicide, okay? And the problem in our country is the story is written by one person, but the headlines are written by another person. So the headlines, people who write the headlines are always sensationalized. The other major issue in our country is suicide is reported by crime reporters, not health reporters. So for the crime reporters, it's always a crime. So that's how they project it. So these things we have to kind of change in that, okay? These are all the guidelines. We have guidelines. I think Australia is the one country which has been doing extremely well in terms of media, because they have a media watch. They monitor the whole thing. So fortunately, we have been working for a long time on this. We have talked to the Press Council, we talked to the PTA, and at last in September, the Press Council of India came out with this statement providing guidelines on suicides and how it should be reported. So it says, don't place stories prominently, don't use language which sensationalizes or normalizes suicide, don't have explicit description of the method, or provide details of site and location, use sensational isolate, but it doesn't say what it should do. What we normally say is what should be done is to use the opportunity to write about suicide as a problem in the community, to give sources of help, helplines, mental health support services, whatever is available, and also to provide opportunity for people who are likely to be distressed to contact the, that is missing, but at least it is a good start. And what is more important is the chairman of the press council has said, now we have passed the guidelines. Now it's up to you to people to bring out where the papers have not followed the guideline. Only then we can take an action. So now it is our responsibility now that if we come across a terrible depiction of suicide reporting in the newspapers or media, if we write to the press council, definitely the press council will take an action. And if 2 or 3 actions are taken place, there will be more people complying with that. But what is important here is if they are really following the guidelines, as psychiatrists, we all have a responsibility because we have said you have to report about local suicides, local rates. So all of us should know what is the local situation in our city, in our town on suicide, what is the rate, who is more at risk, and also what kind of help is available. So if the reporters are going to do that, then you must be well prepared to say what it is, effectively say about suicide situation in your locality. So this means we have to educate the journalists and educate ourselves on how to deal with that. So we have to, it is not enough if we have a law, the law is worthwhile only when it becomes implementable. So we have to work with the media people, and it is a responsibility of all of us as mental health professionals to work with the media and make them aware of the suicide reporting practices, guidelines, and see that this kind of reporting is not going on. Of course, this is the one part of the suicide prevention program, which has suicide prevention national strategy, which has been now actioned, but it can be only based on, see for example, the previous one is exactly how it should not be reported. Okay, so we wrote to the group and said this is not how it should be reported, and reported it to the press council, and the press council wrote to the group, and since then the newspaper has changed how they are reporting on suicide. So this will work when it is embedded in a larger strategy for suicide prevention. As far as the larger strategy for suicide prevention is there, in 2018, the government of India asked for a group of people to write a national strategy, which was written, given, and then it went for comments, and we had to review it, and again it was submitted, and then again it was, no action was taken, and then about few months back they said, we want an action plan to go with the national strategy, which has also been written now, and given the action plan has been now written and given to the government. And just about last week, I asked the ministry, what do I say now? Do we have a national plan or do we not have a national plan? And the Director General of Health Services said, well, for right now, it is in submission. So when it will become implemented, I don't know, but I think we should all work towards that and see that. So I'm not able to show you the complete action plan which I had written because it is still in submission. But one day, hopefully before the next ANCIPS, I would have the opportunity to show that to you. Thank you for your time.
Now I would request Madam Dr. Shubhangi Parkar to start her talk.
Yeah, this is how this one is.
This is next, and this is previous. This is for pointing.
Okay. Thank you very much. I am going to talk about suicide and substance use disorders, policy consideration, since we do not have to any kind of policy that way to look at suicidal behavior in the context of substance use disorders. Let us know about magnitude of the problem. See, individuals with SUDs at 10 to 12 times greater risk for the suicide than general population. Individuals who inject substance at 14 times greater risk for suicide. With alcohol use disorder, risk is 10 times greater for suicide. Individuals are often at elevated risk for suicide when entering the treatment. So this is a very crucial point when they come to the treatment centers. That is a time when there is a probably increased risk, increased haywire pattern of substance use, and co-occurring mental health issues always increase the risk of suicide further. For example, alcohol use disorder and depression. We do not have that particular study below age of 12. So I'm referring this study from US. Approximately 1 in 12 had substance use disorder in the past year. See, in major urban cities in India also, we see now the use of the drug starts around the age of 10 to 12, which used to be 16, 18, or before that even 18 to 21. That means age is reducing. Almost 1/4 engage in binge drinking in the past month there. Over 10% use illicit drugs in the past month. And this is a very good report by Samsha. And opioids, that is including heroin and prescription painkillers, were present in 20% of the suicide death. Marijuana in 10.2%, cocaine in 4.6%, and amphetamine in 3.4%. We have to worry about this because in all our urban cities, newer psychoactive substances are rampant and people are using a lot. There is a lot of arrests are happening, and this is really, in fact, I come from the city of Mumbai, so we see every 2 months there is a big haul on this, and a lot of youngsters are being caught. 35% of heroin-related deaths were attributable to suicide. Remember that. We really have to be worried again on this in our country. Preventing suicide attempts is further warranted because they often recur. So it's not just one, because if in the addiction or in the alcohol, if you see one suicide attempt, probably there is likely risk of repeating it again and again. A past history of suicide attempt represents the strongest predictor for future death by suicide, which I think we see even clinically. We must know about the vulnerability. I mean, who are these people who are vulnerable for suicide in substance use disorder? It is estimated that alcohol dependence alone carries a 7% lifetime risk of suicide compared with 6% risk of affective disorder. So it is even more than depression and affective disorders. Vulnerability is significantly increased and risk doubles with concomitant mental illness and substance use disorder, that is dual diagnosis, compared with affective disorders or alcohol misuse alone or singly. The number of substance use seems to be more, this is interesting, the number of substance use seems to be more predictive of suicide than the types of substance use. So more the number, more the risk. Why substance abuse important in terms of the prevention? Many things. Teenage pregnancy, HIV/AIDS, other sexually transmitted diseases, domestic violence, which is a very important consideration in our country, child abuse, motor vehicle crashes, that is drunken driving, physical fights, crime, homicide and suicide. And that's the reason why the prevention of this particular disorder becomes very important. Emerging issues like adolescent abuse prescription drugs has continued to rise over the past 10 years, especially non-medical use of the prescription pain relievers. The availability of the prescription drugs is increasing from many sources. That is, you have family medicine cabinet, we have a lot of medications, we have sleeping pills which grandmother or grandfather is using, the internet and the doctors. Adolescents also believe that prescription drugs are safer to take than any other street drugs. And that's why we see a lot of use of nitrazepam in Mumbai. Dual burden, this is very important. Many of the factors that increase the risk for substance abuse, such as traumatic experience, also increase the risk for suicidal thoughts and behavior. Substance abuse like mental health problems are also linked with the several-fold increase in suicide risk independently. So when they come together, it is a more risk. Alcohol use associated with increased mortality and increased death rate from vehicle accident more common in younger age group. I think this is, in fact, in my hospital in KM, in the night if you see the emergency medical service, most of the patients are with the accident with head injuries and they are drunk with the bike driving. Why common impact? Why should we think about these two together in terms of prevention? There is a powerful connection between the missions of the substance abuse prevention and treatment communities and the suicide prevention community, because it is the same kind of commitment in terms of the behavioral context of these both. These groups come together around the common goals of preventing miserable tragedy of the human behavior. The suicide and substance abuse prevention field need to align their efforts. This is very important because to promote healthy individuals and healthy communities. If there are important gaps in this, in the estimate of suicide deaths associated with the substance use and substance use disorder, particularly due to cannabis, amphetamine and cocaine use, we really do not have a very good estimate of that. In information about the role of intoxication, we talk about so many things, but the role of acute intoxication by various drugs in suicide attempt. And it is a very important because most of our emergency medical services, we see acute intoxication and suicide attempts. Now, what I'm going to talk about the recommendations. I mean, what kind of recommendation we should have? Ensuring behavioral health care, including screening, because India now has got a very good network of drug treatment clinics. And they are being established in the most of the government, setups like medical colleges or the district hospitals. So screening for suicide should be a routine part of the primary care, and that everyone should have access to this care, and care must be culturally competent, which matters. Barriers for treatment like the lack of providers in rural areas or the need for more residential treatment programs for pregnant women and postpartum women should be addressed by growing the psychiatric component of it. Behavioral health screening and referral services, because we do have the system of primary and secondary and tertiary, so referral services should be really available at all colleges, universities, technical training facilities, and reproductive health clinics, and which we have in Mumbai. We have this kind of 3-tier system pretty well intact. And this is what probably in major urban cities, we must have this into the rural context also. Health insurance and Medicaid coverage for medical-based treatments for substance misuse disorder should be increased. See, it's a lot of time to go because we just started including mental illnesses into the whole context now. Wider recommendation of suicide prevention program, such as the Zero Suicide Initiative, is needed throughout the healthcare system. And I'll tell you, in simple hospitals, you go tertiary care, in the emergency medical services, probably they are not aware that all these people with the suicide attempt, should be referred to the psychiatrist, and this system probably should be, implemented. All hospitals should ensure that any patient in crisis is connected with behavioral health services in a timely manner. State and localities should use pricing strategies to limit the consumption of alcohol by adolescents and young adults. I think it is a millennial generation and we really need to be worried about it. Federal and state governments should prioritize the implementation of the family first prevention services to support prevention services for the families in crisis and to reduce foster care placements. Hospital and birthing centers should screen new mothers for substance misuse disorders at delivery. This is very important. In the city of Mumbai, where I work in a huge public hospitals, we never thought, that the mothers who come probably from that kind of class will have the addictive problems. But many of them, after inquiring, we realized had alcohol and tobacco use. Drug and mental health codes should be created in all states and federal districts. When appropriate, people with the substance misuse disorder should receive mandatory treatments as a part of their incarceration and be connected to in-community treatment service upon their release. I think in India, with the central government, we do have this facility available, though not implemented. Transition programs to assist veterans, that is a different field running to civilian life, should be really available. There should be mental health care system reforms, training and the establishment of minimum norms and standards, provide integrated and comprehensive care, and improve availability and utilization of the resources. I think we need to integrate both this prevention program in undergraduate medical and paramedical system also. Community intervention and proactive prevention, provision of emotional and social support, interventions to prevent substance use and mental health issues, reduce stigma about the substance use and suicidal behavior. There is a post-suicidal stigma is pretty high. And that's the reason why follow-up is very poor in our country, because people generally start, assessing the person who has committed suicide in more negative way than in helpful way. What we need for this is, maybe it is focal, national or international, but at this juncture, we should have large systemic change in the delivery of the mental health care and treatment for substance use disorder. I think after looking at the cleanliness drive of our PM or the plastic removal drive, something which is important for the living and for the community, this kind of drive should come from the central government, and it should come in a very intense way. So, let us take action. Let us commit to stronger collaboration between substance abuse and suicide prevention efforts at all levels, because these are miserable tragedies for the public health system. We should work at community, state, tribal and national level. I think all of us are familiar with the tribal in our country, and maximum alcoholism is there, and it is seen even in the women. The stakes are too high to do otherwise. So let us take action. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Madam Dr. Shubhangi Parkar. Now, the speaker is Dr. Sujit Sarkar. Would you please start your deliberation?
Good evening, everybody. This is the concluding of a presentation of the 3 series of talks, basically relating to government policies and how it could help in suicide prevention, how far we have moved and what is the way forward. So it was initially the media policies which Lakshmi Madam started, followed by substance-related policies which Shubhangi Ma'am highlighted. And now I would briefly conclude by mentioning about the decriminalization of attempted suicide, basically the Indian scenario, and what more needs to be done. So, as we all know, attempted suicide is 20 times more common than completed suicide. And here we are dealing with suicide attempts which are much, much higher in number than completed suicides. And 1/3 of non-fatal suicide behavior subjects attempt suicide in the next 1 year. So the population is actually vulnerable. Who has survived an attempt today may not survive a next attempt. 10% of them eventually die by suicide. Out of the attempted lot, 10% ultimately die by subsequent suicide attempts. So it is very important and essential that we do something to focus on this vulnerable group so that they do not go untouched or uncared for. Most countries across the world have decriminalized suicide. So the number is currently less than 30, the number of countries which have criminalization of suicide as a law. So why should suicide be decriminalized? Criminalization of Suicide Act, it is basically more of a colonial kind of a rule. We inherited it from the British Raj. So it was actually meant to be a deterrent to suicide. So the basic idea was that if you punished suicide attempt survivors, it would scare him and it would scare others not to commit suicide. But that was wrongly founded. In reality, it only hampers suicide reporting. What it actually does is it harasses legally the survivor of the attempt as well as the family members. And in their effort to bypass the legal system, what they do is they usually try to make it sound like accidental poisoning, overdose, and things like that. So cases of attempted suicide are often passed off as accidental overdose. As a result, the subject's mental health issues remain unaddressed and untreated. So we leave a huge number of suicide attempters unreported and hence untreated. And they are the ones who are likely to commit suicide in the next 1 year. This increases chances of repeat attempt. So, what has Mental Health Care Act 2017 achieved? This is the question. See, attempt to die by suicide is dealt with in section 115 of Mental Health Care Act 2017, and part 1 of the section states that notwithstanding anything contained in section 309 of the IPC. See, section 309 of the IPC is the act according to which any person who attempts suicide is liable to be prosecuted, to be imprisoned for up to a term of 1 year. So notwithstanding anything contained in section 309, which means that despite whatever is contained in the act, section 115 will follow. Any person who attempts to die by suicide shall be presumed, unless proved otherwise, to have severe stress and shall not be tried and punished under the said code. So, if a person survives a suicide attempt, he is to be treated, to be cared for, rather than being punished. So, this has an overriding effect on the existing 309 IPC. But still, there are many twists in the language which can subsequently lead to harassment of the subject. Part 2 of section 115 also goes on to say that the state shall be responsible for proper care and treatment of the person concerned. Thus, the Act goes a long way in decriminalizing suicide by not only making such an attempt non-punishable, but also goes on to confer responsibility on the state for proper treatment of the subject. So as far as this part is concerned, it appears quite hunky-dory in the sense that it seems that everything has been taken care of in terms of decriminalization of suicide. So now the question is, what has happened to section 309 IPC? See, it still remains, although section 115 has an overriding effect on the act. So the act is there. So the sting from the act is gone, but the act still remains. and there are situations where the act can come into force. I would again go back to the previous slide which said any person who attempts to die by suicide shall be presumed unless proved otherwise. So there is a provision of if it is proved otherwise, the person may be prosecuted. So section 309 has lost its sting, but it still remains and may be misutilized or may be used to harass the person. Next is, what are the pitfalls at the ground level? So this is the act. Many states are yet to frame the state mental health rules, and as a result, even Mental Health Act 1987 is still going on in many states, because after the center has passed the act, the state is to frame the mental health rules, and then only the act comes into force in the state. So there are many states which have not framed their rules. So in those states, the decriminalization effect of section 115 is yet to have its full effect. Section 309 has not been repealed. So unless it is repealed, it will keep on cropping up in different legal situations. So that is one area which has to be worked upon. Police personnel all over the country are not adequately trained or informed about MHCA 2017. Thus, harassment continues. So this is one major problem. Now comes to the emergency department. You see, we psychiatrists do not get the cases of suicide attempt. It's usually at the emergency department of state-run or private hospitals. So the emergency department of government and private hospitals are not informed. This leads to fear-mongering and unfair practices. Fear-mongering in the sense that the guardians may be told by an unscrupulous or an uninformed person that this is a punishable offense. It is better that we do not report, or it is better that we hush it up. So let us do it, and maybe some people can ask for money in return. This is one possibility. In another cases, if it is uninformed, they may even refuse to treat the patient properly, depending upon the attitude of the hospital or the attitude of the doctor concerned. Sections related to abatement of suicide exist. Now I will take a pause to explain this part. You see, abatement of suicide remains a crime. You may ask that if abatement is a crime, then here is a situation where a person has attempted a suicide but has not died, has survived a suicide attempt. So would abatement still be applicable to the abater? The answer is yes. Even if the suicide attempt does not lead to the death of the individual, the abatement law applies. So the police has to investigate to rule out any foul play or abatement in this case. Although if the person doesn't die by suicide, the punishment for abatement is lesser, usually half or one-third duration of that which would have happened if the person had died. But still, abatement rule is there. So the police comes in a different way, but the police has to come and investigate. So this necessitates police investigation to rule out foul play. So keeping all these things in mind, what we find out is that though section 309 IPC has been kind of neutralized to a great extent, but section 115 is still not complete in itself, because the provision of severe stress is there. Severe stress is not a very clear-cut, defined, quantifiable term, and it is open to interpretation. This is number one. This will lead to a lot of legal wranglings. Number two, previously, when the original act was formed, before it became a bill, it was actually preceded by the term mental illness. So if a person has attempted suicide, it would be presumed that he has done it as a fallout of mental illness. But because of the stigma associated with the term mental illness, subsequently it was changed to severe stress. That is good in one sense, but the flip side is that if severe stress is used as a construct, it is difficult to define, it is difficult to quantify, and often, since it's a little vague term, it is difficult to prove emphatically. So that is one major problem. Information of all hospitals from the state health department, that is a major step that has to be taken, especially in states where state mental health rules are in place. Notification of all police stations from the state home department, that is also another thing that has to take place, or else the harassment, misinformation will continue and the attempt survivors will keep on getting pressurized and suicide reporting will be affected. Massive awareness campaigns at public level to sensitize them about the legal developments, and obviously quick implementation of the state mental health rules in all these states so that it is effective as early as possible. So these are the areas on which we have to work further. Apart from repealing trying to repeal section 309 of IPC, the basic message that should go is we should try to use the good part of section 115 IPC, where the state says that, where it says that the state has to take care of the person. So probably there should be a provision which says that if a patient of suicide attempt is admitted in an emergency after proper care and after proper medical care, probably evaluation by a mental health professional should be made mandatory so that the person is not lost to follow up due to stigma. So this is one major step which can be done, especially at the level of implementation of state mental health rules. State mental health rules can make subtle variations, although the spirit of the act should remain the same. So I think I would also like to have the opinion of the House in the discussion forum. So with this, I come to the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Sujit, for completing your presentation in a very smart manner and within the stipulated time. So the 3 questions are allowed. Please, Baridda. Remember.
This question is to Dr. Shujit Sharkil. You talked about abandonment of suicide. My question here is that sometimes when there is a personality disorder, a patient with personality disorder, and she or he is repeatedly attempting suicide, they often also mention a particular name because they can be manipulative, or their suicide attempts could be revengeful. In such a case, the Abetment Act would come into sort of what happens. This is a very risky situation where, you know, somebody is being named as being the cause for this person's distress, but this could just be, you know, part of her revengeful behavior. So what is the law here?
Basically, ma'am, once a person or once a subject who has attempted suicide and is brought to the emergency department, medico-legal reporting is mandatory, because what the law says that ultimately it is not the prerogative of the medical person to decide whether it's a suicide or homicide. Our primary job is to treat, the medical team. So anyway, a reporting to the law keepers must be done. So once the reporting is done, it is for them to investigate 2 things. One is whether there is any foul play, rather means a homicide being masqueraded as a suicide or not, first step. Second step is to find out whether there is role of any individual in abetment. In fact, in abetment, there are one law which says that even if you abet somebody to abet the individual, then I am also punishable. So it can be a chain reaction also. So it is basically for the police to rule out any abetment. Here the role of the clinician doesn't come.
Right, okay. So, I mean, over here, in an emergency situation, it is not also possible to get the full story and to come to the conclusion that actually the other person who this person is trying to blame has abetted towards the suicide may actually be an innocent person. I mean, let's give an example, a borderline personality disorder. They often can actually blame the psychiatrist, blame the treating psychiatrist because they are wanting, because of the kind of transference issues, etc. They become very dependent on the psychiatrist, and if they want to cause problems, then I mean, if they have attempted and they are blaming the psychiatrist, then if the full history is not taken, that is where, in this case, I'm talking about a psychiatrist, it can be any other person. So that is where the danger lies. So unless that, you're saying that it is for the police to take the whole...
Yes.
Take the whole...
Because this is a part of investigation. So here it is the prerogative of the IO and not any medical person to actually decide even if there is a malified intent, that has to be cleared through investigations.
Thank you so much.
Hello, I just want to say, we see this kind of many cases, okay, where personality disorder is there. So in this case, my job is to write the history properly, write my impression and leave it at that juncture.
Right.
Okay? See, police ask for the record, whatever they do. I don't bother whether this is something, criminal, non-criminal, whatever it is. If there is a, borderline, we do evaluation, we do psychological evaluation, document everything and leave it at that juncture.
See, I have documents of patients from the day I started practice. I keep my own files.
Yeah.
So for the last 22 years since coming back, I have files. But I'm saying a patient is now going to an emergency. I don't know what kind of record keeping in an emergency situation, how thoroughly a psychiatrist is, whether at all a psychiatrist is going to be called to do an evaluation. And a medical person who's taking the history of somebody who's attempted suicide is never going to be one like that of a psychiatrist. So in our country, that's what happens.
But you have to mention the objective and the subjective data both properly. Basically, for example, you said the people can be innocent, but you can always write because...
In my case file, that way I am protected. But in case of others who are not, who are... Often I have come across cases who have come to us for treatment because somebody has mentioned them as for abatement of suicide.
But that is police's job.
Yeah.
Well, we are talking about suicide prevention. And the vast majority of suicide are associated with depression. And depression is a treatable illness, generally speaking. Now, in public for educating the public, we need to focus on this, that depression is treatable. You come and have treatment. This will have a major impact, or more impact than anything else we discuss here on suicide prevention. I thought you would mention this.
Depression is an important factor, there is no doubt about it. In fact, the catchphrase is depression is treatable, suicide is preventable. That is the catchphrase we do every year. But having said that, from the psychological autopsy studies done in low and middle income countries like India, Sri Lanka and China, we find that depression is there present only in about 35 to 40% of people who die by suicide. So though depression does play an important role as a disorder, depressive symptoms may be present, but in about 50% of people who die by suicide in our country, it is a very impulsive behavior. And what we have found is that in about 20% of the cases, it's a decision which is taken in the last 30 minutes. So we have to give equal importance to depression as well as impulsivity, availability of means to die by suicide, media. So there is no single one suicide prevention strategy which will reduce suicide. It is always multidimensional, multi-focus, and only as many as different players are involved, suicides can be reduced. In fact, that's why I put the last slide.
where in the national strategy we have asked about not only mental health, Department of Agriculture for pesticide, Department of Education for resilience in school children, information and broadcasting for media, then district mental health program, then NGOs, and even educating the traditional healers, and women's group, youth group, so you have to, there is no single reason for suicide. Same way, there is no single preventive strategy. It has to be...
Yeah, thank you. But what I'm saying is I'm not minimizing the role of any other factor. What I'm saying is this is probably the biggest factor because in US, like they say, 85% of patients who commit suicide, they have depression. So they have alcohol abuse, other substance abuse, poverty, unemployment, whatever. But if depression can be treated, which is easier than treating alcohol abuse and some other factors, unemployment. So what I'm saying is, well, we have to try everything, but this is probably bigger than other factors.
Yeah. No, in this symposium, we are not talking about every other aspects of suicide prevention. We are talking about the laws in India, legal India, the policy changes which has happened recently. So we focused on the change in media policy, change in the national policy like that, in the criminal. So, but what you're saying is absolutely right when you're looking at in a holistic manner.
Yeah, thank the presenters. What a lovely session. Two comments. First, on Lakshmi ma'am, this media thing, I think you have improved the scenario in Chennai. I saw the presentation in April. Now here also it gives a clue. But talking about in West Bengal and also the state where I work in Chhattisgarh, the rate is very high. Now the thing is that media, particularly the visual media, still keep on going, show the methods. In West Bengal also, I tried with my journalist friends. They said, well, this keeps happening, what you can do. So they are somehow resistant that psychiatrists will come and they will teach them. So that means they are not concerned about the lives that's actually getting lost. So I don't know. I mean, should we file a PIL against the press? Or should we keep writing letters and flood it? Particularly the visual media, you will see, they definitely sensationalize. And sometimes they make stories like dramas and all those things. So I wonder that how would it stop? That's my, humble query to you.
Yeah, really a question which I'm not able to answer because
I know.
It is a huge problem. And not only is the visual media, it is the digital media, you you have explicit descriptions in the media on how to, if there are sites which the youngsters know, which we don't know, the dark web, they go there and gives you explicit directions on how to die by suicide, which is the most painless method, where you can get this. And in fact, they sell suicide kits online, and many children are buying that also. So it is totally unregulated, and we are still at odds because the more we try to, for example, there are a lot of people who are streaming suicide on the Facebook, okay? So then we wrote to the Facebook, and the Facebook took notice, and now any of this streaming is stopped immediately as soon as it comes. And if they have stated something like that in Facebook, Facebook has a trigger. It informs the friends and relatives that this person is feeling low, try and help him, something. But the more challenges than the above the ground media is the dark web. Dark web is terrible because we don't know how to get into it. Those people know how to get into it, and it is going on but people are working on it, and we will get there someday.
Right. One small to Dr. Sarkel. Dr. Sarkel, what I tell you, that's about our dilemma. So I work in a secondary hospital, where what happens when the attempt suicide comes, So obviously it's very difficult to elicit the history because people are fear to talk about that whether one has attempted or not. And the police is still uneducated, so they come and they actually file a case. So when I told them the law is there, so they said कि सर को जाके समझाइए. So it's a kind of a practical situation where actually for us, we are at a loggerhead, we're in a dilemma. We don't know. And you are absolutely correct. We have seen 3 patients who have attempted suicide, survived, but within 1 year actually they committed suicide. So this is a very, very practical dilemma for us actually to save the life, and particularly the younger people. So if you can comment.
I think Lakshmi ma'am will also agree. The only way out is notification from the home department to the police stations. They will not listen to doctors. If only, basically 2-stage procedure, as long as the state doesn't frame the mental health rules, so technically the Mental Health Care Act doesn't become effective at ground level for that particular state. So for your state of work, if Chhattisgarh, I don't know whether they have framed the rules. If it is framed, then the notification has to come from the home department. Basically, health department notifies the home department, and from the home department, notification has to come to all the police stations. They are bound to oblige. Ma'am, anything else?
Yes, even though it is a state of confusion, because on one hand you have the Mental Health Act, and on the other hand you have IPC 309. So you don't know whether you have to notify, not notify, what to do. So this is a state of flux. The permanent solution to that is to remove the IPC 309, for which we have been working for more than a decade, and hopefully we'll get there some day. But right now it is in the redundant list. See, the government has recently asked the law department to make a redundant list of redundant laws. So we have managed to put that in the redundant laws. So if the government clears it and says, okay, it is a redundant law, it may be removed. There's a chance. But otherwise, each state, as Sujit has said, has the ability to interpret the Mental Health Act and say, it is now, you don't need to notify. But on the other hand, to get the accurate number, many of the states have introduced the Health Information System, HMIS system. So if we can add one line and say attempted suicide, then we will have the figures and contacts to contact them and prevent repeat.
So, in spite of the fact of the session, there is a very lively interaction. So we may conclude the session for the day. The mic is handed over to the organizers.
I would like to request our chairperson to honor our speakers. I would like to request Dr. Abir Mukherjee to come on the stage to honor our chairpersons.
नहीं है.
Very nice.
वो ना